Community Living Network.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Melanson, Executive Director of the California Community Living Network. We are a statewide membership organization with over 100 provider members, large and small, across the state of California, representing supported living, independent living, respite, personal assistance, and employment services. Thank you to the committee chair, committee members, and committee staff for this opportunity. And especially thank you to all of the extraordinary efforts from our entire community to keep people healthy and safe throughout this public health crisis. I must begin by acknowledging and appreciating the Department of Developmental Services and Nancy Bargman's efforts and the collaboration that CCLN has had and continues to have with them, even in such difficult and challenging times as we all juggle competing priorities. As Mr. Winfield previously mentioned, CCLN always appreciates when we have time with you all. I've been asked to describe the challenges that providers of in-person services have experienced during the pandemic and what challenges remain. Certainly all of our lives have drastically changed since the beginning of the pandemic. CCLN held a legislative briefing in September of 2020 titled In-Person Services in a Pandemic. The 2-hour recording can be found on our website at ccln.org. That program detailed how the extraordinary efforts of in-person services have been critical in keeping Californians safe throughout the public health crisis. You will hear all about how in-person services rose to meet a pandemic moment in a COVID-19 minute. The urgent and immediate priority of maintaining the health and safety of staff and the people served began on day one. In-person providers had to become infection control experts and secure an adequate supply of personal protective equipment and an abundance of cleaning and sanitation supplies, all while providing increased staff and client training. All of this was at a tremendous cost to the providers in the network. The first question was, would staff show up for work? And fortunately, they did. We immediately began to train on how to look for signs and symptoms of COVID-19 and develop detailed response plans. As lockdowns were implemented across the state, providers were managing and balancing demands and expectations of family visits and the client's desire to continue with their chosen way of life. We were already facing a workforce crisis, and providers increased their efforts to find ways to attract, recruit, retain, and train new employees in our new COVID-19 world. That included managing the already complex relationship with in-home support services and scheduling and rescheduling adequate staffing coverage based on staff's exposure, test positive for COVID-19, and the need for staff to quarantine. The workforce crisis, which has been a crisis before, during, and is still true today, continues to be the biggest challenge for providers of in-person services. What are some of the different ways providers have had to adapt and change their operations during the public health emergency? The shrinking of support teams was essential to limit exposure to COVID-19. Less staff in and out of the homes equals less risk of exposure to everyone. Coverage for the additional daytime hours due to the day service closures. In many cases, the day services and employment support roles and responsibilities so that clients could maintain their paid internships and employment when day service providers were forced to close and discontinue services. Increasing the hours for respite and personal assistance to provide the much-needed support and relief to keep families together and safe. Coordinating multiple health and safety waiver requests for multiple clients at multiple regional centers, for increasing the hours of support and for covering the cost of the dramatically increasing overtime. Compliance with new sick leave mandates and arranging and rearranging coverage needs accordingly. And preparing for the mounting mental health crisis as a result of isolation, loss of routines, and post-traumatic stress due to the lockdowns and the shelters in place. Now we're focused on vaccines. Are there specific directives that have been especially beneficial to providers? Yes, extremely helpful. While critical and well-intended, the interpretations and implementations of the DDS directives does vary wildly throughout the 21 regional centers across the state, as Ms. Pettick mentioned. As a statewide membership organization, we hear the vast differences from our over 100 provider members. Bungling bureaucracies was a fair statement, Madam Chair. The directives must be more specific and prescriptive, not just issued as guidance. They must provide for flexibility for exceptions and should not be used to deny access to service or funding for providers. The virtual supports directives for ILS that allowed for remote supports has been incredibly effective. Although it must not be exclusive of in-person supports, the directive has complemented and increased the quality of the service and improved the outcome for the people served, especially health and safety outcomes. This would be a directive that allowed for a hybrid of in-person and virtual supports that we would recommend continue post-pandemic. The isolation rate directive for SLS was released in January of 2021. It finally allowed for a competitive wage for our direct support professionals. While the directive could have been issued earlier or at least been made retroactive back to March 2020 to make providers whole as they courageously combated the challenges they faced by the pandemic, our provider network was grateful for the directive. Directive expanding the access to the self-determination program offered more options for people served and families. And although not a directive, the vaccine letters provided for staff and families issued by DDS were greatly applauded by our network and people served. In closing, the pandemic has only highlighted the need for a focus on the future, the need for our entire community to come together for coordinated emergency response efforts in any type of crisis or disaster. I do want to take just a brief moment to honor a direct support professional who passed away last month, not directly due to transmitting COVID-19, but out of an abundance of caution to reduce his exposure to COVID-19. Matthew Maddie John Spanton dedicated 22 years of his career to support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and was one of the first recipients of the first round of the California Community Living Network's Direct Support Professional of the Year Recognition Award. It's because of Maddie and all the DSPs just like Maddie that CCLN will continue to fight for professionalizing the workforce and demanding competitive wages. Providers must have the ability to pay staff a competitive wage. It's our workforce that connects the people served with the access points necessary to achieve their chosen way of life. We are nothing without them. We must pay them accordingly and eliminate the sunset suspension language for the 8.2 supplemental rate increases. It's destabilizing for providers in a public health crisis. And finally, as always, increased transparency, accountability, and identifying the quality measurable outcomes for people served to achieve their chosen way of life. CCLN's sponsored bill AB 813, authored by Assemblymember Mullen, will move us in that necessary direction towards those quality measurable outcomes. CCLN looks forward to continuing our partnership with the administration, the legislators, and the department as we continue to move forward in 2021 and beyond. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak on today's panel. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you for very vividly, with your picture, paints 1,000 words, bringing the providers into the room with us. We appreciate it and can only imagine the difficulties of trying to maintain services to a vulnerable population during a pandemic. And we thank you and Mr. Rogan for your all the departments, but those of you who are doing the work right on the ground. We thank you. LAO, any further questions or remarks after these presentations? Department of Finance?
No, thank you. No.
Okay. All right. I think we certainly have our work cut out for us, and I would also just like to reiterate. I think the importance of planning for the next decade. I think we've all acknowledged the setbacks that we've had during the pandemic, and I think we were slow on planning for this population prior to the pandemic, and now coming out, I think we've all seen how the shaky ground that we stand on, and the need, especially in dealing with people with ID and their families, have for creating a firm foundation so people can begin to plan and feel comfortable about where we're going. Dr. Pan?
Thank you, and I appreciate the presentations. Yes, a couple of things. First of all, I do want to follow up on the LAO's report around the I guess the lack of certainty for DDS providers, and appreciate that the department's trying to address that. But it gets really hard to plan if you have flexibility. It's you're told for 30 days. Maybe someone will say, well, it'll probably be longer than that, etc. So it'd be great to have some better feedback on both the idea of what kind of flexibilities can be committed to throughout until the end of the state of emergency, and also which ones that seem like it will, that we should continue beyond, right? That makes sense that this is the way we should perhaps we can normally do business. That this makes it easier on families and allows us to be more efficient and so forth. So I hope that we can get a report back from the department by me, at least before May revise on those particular points. The other issue, and I know that our chair had asked about how many people visited the DDS website. I would make note that that question wasn't actually answered. The answer was that we have a wonderful website that has a lot of wonderful resources and it has accessibility and so forth. I appreciate that, but the question actually was how many people visit the website. And the reason I'm sort of going back to that is that I'm sure the department also uses other mechanisms, but sometimes in terms of how we communicate, posting things on a website certainly is important for people as a reference, but oftentimes that's not a very effective way for people to find out. Now, I'm sure the department also has other mechanisms where it more proactively gets information out to people. But again, if you're having a situation where you have flexibilities that are only for short periods of time, there's uncertainty of funding and so forth, having a more proactive, engaged form of communications is going to be important because instead of a more passive way where people have to find the information instead of information being put in front of them that's relevant to them. So again, I would appreciate the department perhaps following up. We don't need an answer right now, but on how it's going about doing it. And I know that you do more than just put things on a website, but we want to be sure that the various providers and clients are able to more easily get information that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Melendez, I don't see your hand up, so I'm going to then take us on to issue number 3.